must tell you, you all sounded really good. Don't let it go to your head, but you look even better, okay? Just, try to do what I can do. I had a friend email me a cartoon from New York Magazine. It showed two businessmen sitting in a pub, one of whom was obviously very despondent. The one who was unhappy said to his companion, quote, "I was on the cutting edge. I pushed the envelope. I did the heavy lifting. I was the rainmaker. I was the straw that stirred the drink." Then suddenly it all crashed when I ran out of metaphors. Metaphors. They are clearly a significant role in our lives, are they not? I mean, not just as linguistic tools, but as so much more. Because you see, metaphors shape our thinking. Metaphors convey our philosophy. They can even express theological concepts. Of course, metaphors, whether short and pithy or deep and extensive, are not simply a modern communication phenomenon. In fact, they're probably as old as the human language. For example, we know that the master teacher, Jesus himself, taught in parables, sort of an extended metaphor. Beautiful symbolic stories that would provoke contemplation and challenge the status quo. In fact, symbolic language was extensive in Jesus' teachings. Perhaps you recall the words, "I am the vine, you are the branches." Or, "I am the light of the world." And he tells us about the pearl of great price. He tells us about the wheat and the tares. He tells us about the house that was built on shifting sand. Unlike our businessman in the New Yorker cartoon, Jesus never seems to run out of metaphors. So, as a result, not surprisingly, across the centuries, there has been this debate, this discussion regarding metaphors as it's used in Scripture. The question being answered, or trying to be answered, is it really justifiable to take the language of the Bible metaphorically? Or does our reverence for the text require us to understand them as literally as possible? I happen to think it's a discussion of great importance, because what is conveyed in the biblical language is something that is significant to all of us. After all, we don't really want to miss a shred of meaning that the Scriptures have intended for us. If you have your Bibles or New Testaments this morning, turn to Mark's Gospel, chapter 8. Mark chapter 8, and we're going to begin reading in verse 27. Mark tells us in chapter 8, beginning in verse 27, that Jesus and his disciples went on to the villages around Caesarea Philippi. On the way, he asked them, "Who do people say I am?" They replied, "Some say John the Baptist, others say Elijah, and still others one of the prophets." "But what about you?" Jesus makes it personal at this point. He says, "Who do you say I am?" And Peter, as he so often did, spoke up and said, "You are the Messiah. You are the Christ, the Son of the living God." And Jesus warned them not to tell anyone about him. Mark then tells us that he began to teach them that the Son of Man must suffer many things and be rejected by the elders, the chief priests, and the teachers of the law, and that he must be killed and after 3 days rise again. He spoke plainly about this, and Peter took him aside and began to rebuke him. But when Jesus turned and looked at his disciples, he rebuked Peter. "Get behind me, Satan," he said. "You do not have in mind the concerns of God, but merely human concerns." Then he called the crowd to him, along with his disciples, and said, "Whoever wants to be my disciple must deny themselves and take up their cross and follow me. For whoever wants to save their life will lose it, but whoever loses their life for me and for the gospel will save it. What good is it for someone to gain the whole world, yet forfeit their soul? Or what can anyone give in exchange for their soul? If anyone is ashamed of me and my words in this adulterous and sinful generation, the Son of Man will be ashamed of them when he comes in his Father's glory with his holy angels." So let me ask you, how would you understand today's text? Metaphorically or literally? Look again at what Jesus said. "If any want to become my followers, let them deny themselves, take up their cross, and follow me." As a man by the name of Stephen Garnis Holmes has said, quote, "The cross in Jesus' day was not a logo or a metaphor. The cross was an instrument of pain, shame, absolute loss, and death. It was a real weapon. The only way to take it up was to become its real victim," end quote. You see, when Jesus picked up his cross, it was to set himself against the Roman Empire. It was to set himself against the temple authority. It was to set himself against the ideology of the world that oppressed and shackled God's people. When Jesus took up his cross, it was against everything that hindered the inbreaking of God's kingdom to come. He picked up his cross to go to his death, literally. But when the writer of Mark's gospel related Jesus' teachings on the matter, we began to see that something new was slipping into the meaning and the implication of cross-bearing, because as Jesus told it, every one of his followers must what? Bear a cross. The question then becomes, will every one of Jesus' followers face the same cruel and tragic death that Jesus faced? Well, in Mark's day, the threat of crucifixion was still there. I mean, in fact, as this gospel was being written some 40 years after Jesus' death, conflict was everywhere. Social, political, and religious instability were inescapable. Rome was appointing a new Caesar after Nero had died. The temple in Jerusalem was under siege and soon was to be destroyed, while Jews were now divided over supporting Rome or rising up against it. And the fledgling band of Jesus' followers found themselves simply caught in the middle. Their beliefs neither persuaded them to fight Rome, nor did they encourage them to support Rome. It was a time in which neighborhoods were divided, families were divided. It was a very difficult, dangerous time, a desperate time. And this line from Mark's gospel about cross-bearing reminded Christ's very early band of followers of the cross very literal to the potential to take their life. You see, depending on the choices Jesus' early band of followers made, the cross might very well take their life. That's how it was. But it's also, this line was spoken by Jesus, would have reminded them of the prospect the cross offered in order that they might gain everything. If I were to ask you this morning, if the cross still had its uses, for your life and for mine, what would you say? I mean, granted, the cross is no longer employed as the Romans used it in Jesus' day to put insurrectionists to their literal death. But so powerful and so formative is the cross in Christian identity that its potential lives on. Now, in modern times, perhaps we could understand the cross to be a place of ultimate transformation, a place to hang our arrogance, a place to crucify our rage or our bitterness or our prejudice or our greed, in order that we might let them die there, so that perhaps something more eternally good and grace-filled and Christ-like might be resurrected. So the question for us this morning is, what do we need to hang on the cross? It's not unlike the question that Jesus asked his disciples as they walked along. Who do people say that I am? Oh, they had answers. Some say you're this, some say you're him. But then Jesus got real personal. He said, but who do you say that I am? What Jesus is implying there is it really doesn't matter what others say I am or who others say I am. The real question is, who do you say that I am? If the cross is to still have meaning, is there something within you, around you, that should be hung there? In other words, is there something in the living of your life that needs to die for something else more gracious and good and generative to live? Think about the hundreds and thousands of Christians who over the centuries have trusted in the cross's power to change things. Whether in their own personal hearts and souls, or whether a change was required because of a social condition or a political injustice, or perhaps even national arrogance. Make no mistake, such cross bearers often carry a heavy load as they take up their crosses to follow Jesus. But here's the thing. History tells us they've done it time and time again, with the sure and certain conviction that the potential and the power of the cross that burst into the world when Jesus first shouldered it is the same thing that is now accessible to each and every Christian. The cross now is our means to grasp and enlist the transformative power which is capable of making God's kingdom more fully present among us. In other words, the cross still has the power to change things. It still has the power to change people. Perhaps one of the most stirring examples of cross-bearing that we have comes from the story of William Wilberforce. How many of you in here have heard the name William Wilberforce? I see some. While many of us may not know his name, we can all see the result of his walk with Jesus and the transformative power of the cross. You see, as observers have noted, it all began in 1787 in London. London was prosperous in those days, but it was decadent. The Industrial Revolution was swinging into full gear, and tired children found themselves working excruciating 18-hour days. A significant portion of the economy was run by British ships and their captains who served the British plantation industry in the West Indies. Their cargo? Human beings. Human beings who were being captured in Africa and auctioned into slavery. In these tumultuous times, when exploitation and unrest were rampant, few gave a second glance to the tragedy of black African slavery. However, Wilberforce felt the weight of his Christian convictions, and he couldn't deny them. As a young politician, only 29 years old, he introduced the first bill into Parliament in 1788, proposing to abolish slave trade. It was soundly defeated. So Wilberforce decides to begin this campaign with other Christian abolitionists. They distributed pamphlets, they spoke at public meetings, they circulated petitions, they wrote songs, they organized boycotts of slave-grown sugar, but public sentiment was not easily changed. In fact, Wilberforce was mocked in the press. He was humiliated in the halls of government. He was even challenged to a duel by one self-righteous plantation owner who felt that he had been unfairly maligned by Wilberforce's campaign to change public opinion on slavery. And yet, in the midst of all of this, William Wilberforce, he carried on unremittingly. Year after year after year after year, bills were proposed. And year after year after year after year, those bills proposed to abolish slavery were defeated. But finally, after many difficult years, William Wilberforce saw the change that he had dreamed of. For yet another abolition bill was introduced to Parliament in the House of Lords and in the House of Commons. And just before the vote was called, one member rose to give a very stirring tribute to William Wilberforce and his unwavering conviction to end that which was evil. Then the vote was taken. This time, there were 283 yeses. There were only 16 noes. At last, the motion overwhelmingly carried, and Wilberforce sat quietly, head bowed, tears flowing down what was now a wrinkled face, because it had been that long since this 20-something-year-old politician had first introduced a bill to do just that. It's an impressive story. Stop and think about it. One man who breathed like us, one man who walked like us, one man who thought and spoke and talked like us, accomplished the extraordinary because he did all that he did in the company of a man called Jesus. And while Wilberforce metaphorically shouldered his cross, all the while he hung upon it the shame of slavery until it died on that cross. And freedom literally came to life for thousands upon thousands upon thousands of individuals. Crosses? Jesus carried one literally. And his followers have been asked to shoulder them ever since. So let me ask you this morning, does the cross play a role in your existence? To be quite honest, I don't expect that many of us feel the crushing weight. Neither do I sense that most of us feel splinters in our hands. But here's the thing. If we are people of Jesus Christ, the cross should be something more than a vague memory or an empty metaphor. The cross, all that it means, all of the power that it holds, and all of the transformation it enables ought to stand central in the living of our lives. There was a French sculptor by the name of Rodin who one day found this enormous, carefully carved wooden crucifix beside a road. And Rodin bought that cross that he admired so much and had it carried to his home or carted to his home. But when it arrived, he discovered that the cross was far too big to fit inside his house. So what did he do? He knocked down the walls, raised the roof, in order that he might rebuild his house around that cross. That, my friends, is an incredible metaphor. What if the cross was central to our lives? What if the cross was central to our homes? What if the cross was central to our very being as individuals? In other words, what if you and I lived under its shadow every single day? What if it stood so near that we could pick it up whenever its power was needed? What if we were poised to hang every evil on that cross? Every injustice on that cross? Every hardship and pain on that cross? In order that we might let the cross do its work as it has for millions of people for thousands upon thousands of years. If you and I were willing to do that, then perhaps it would be something more than empty metaphor. Perhaps if you and I were willing to do that, the cross would still be doing its work. And what's more, those of us who are agents that employed that cross would allow us to become God's agents of transformation. Indeed, we would be metaphorically the cutting edge. We would be pushing the envelope. We would be doing the heavy lifting. We would be the rainmakers. We would be the straw that stirs the drink. Jesus says, take up your cross and follow me. What greater call could we ever accept than that?